Hello and welcome to the second episode of This and That English podcast. My name is Alan and I am here to help you improve your English through listening. This podcast is especially for lower intermediate or intermediate learners of English, but of course everyone is welcome to listen. Hello again. In the last episode, I talked about the importance of starting. It's very important to start. Of course, it's very important to start. If you don't start, nothing will get done. Nothing will happen. Your life won't change. But we know that now, and hopefully we have all started. Today, in the last episode, I said I would tell you a little bit about myself and also about this podcast. First of all, as I have mentioned a few times, my name is Alan. I'm from Ireland. I'm an Irishman, and now I live in Okinawa. When I say now, that means when I am recording this podcast. I don't know when you're listening to this podcast, so this could be a long time in the past. But as I record this podcast, I am living in Okinawa. I moved to Japan in July 2001. In July 2001, I moved to Japan and I lived in Tokyo for a short while in Chofu City before I moved to Yokohama. And I lived in Yokohama for about 10 years. And after Yokohama, I moved to Okinawa. So now I live in Okinawa. I live in a town called Nishihara. Nishihara is a town east of Naha. Okinawa Island is a very small place, so Nishihara is very close to Naha. It's a very nice place. It's a little bit rural, but there's a shopping center and there are many parks and we even have a beach. It's very nice. So, why am I making this podcast? Well, I teach English in Okinawa. I taught English in Yokohama too. And I study Japanese. Recently, I started listening to podcasts in Japanese to improve my Japanese, and I really enjoy them. So I wanted my students also to listen to podcasts to help them improve their English. There are many ways to study English, so and to study Japanese too, of course. So why am I interested in podcasts? Actually, I'm quite busy. I have 3 children and I have various things that keep me busy. I have an online business and I do housework, laundry and cooking, and I go shopping and things like that. And with a podcast, while I am doing other things, I can study Japanese. That's why I started to be very interested in Japanese. That's why I started to be very interested in podcasts. So while I'm doing laundry or cooking or doing the dishes or going to the supermarket, I can listen. Or even when I'm in the car, I can listen to the podcasts. And then it's an easy way to continue studying Japanese without stopping everything else. If you're using a textbook, it's very difficult to use a textbook and wash the dishes at the same time, right? But it's very easy to listen to a podcast and wash the dishes at the same time. So I started to listen to podcasts. I listen to now maybe 6 or 7 different Japanese podcasts. I had there were podcasts that I listened to at the beginning. Like maybe at first I chose one podcast. Each episode was about 10 or 15 minutes, and I thought that was a good length. I thought I might get tired if I listened to podcasts non-stop. So I thought maybe a 30-minute podcast might make me so tired. So I chose the podcast that was about 10 or 15 minutes long. There was another point that was important for me in choosing a podcast. I had listened to some podcasts before, and I had watched some YouTube videos, but I found that a lot of the Japanese podcasts that were teaching English people how to speak Japanese were taught using, they were made using English. But I didn't really want to spend my time listening to English explanations. Like I just wanted to hear Japanese in a normal situation. So I stopped listening to those types of podcasts or watching those YouTube videos very quickly. But I came across a recommendation, I think on the Tofugu website, Tofugu blog. It's quite a good resource for people studying Japanese. It's a great place to get information about how to study Japanese. Tofugu is tofu. Fugu is the fugu is the fish, and Tofugu. They merged the names. I don't know why. Anyway, it's a cute name. Tofugu. Anyway, I follow the Tofugu blog, and on one of the blogs they recommended a podcast by Noriko. It was called Japanese with Noriko. And I thought, okay, I listened to it. And I listened to it. Noriko is actually a professional teacher. She teaches Japanese now online, but before that, she became a fully qualified teacher. I forget what type of teacher, elementary school teacher or high school teacher. I just don't remember. Sorry, Noriko. Anyway, so she had a very clear voice. I found it very easy to understand her. And while I thought 15 minutes might be a long time to listen to Japanese, I actually found it quite easy to listen to her for 15 minutes. So I continued and I listened to all of her podcasts. I still listen to her new podcasts today. And then I wanted to listen to more, and then there's a famous Japanese podcast called Nihongo Konteppe. About Noriko. About Noriko. Noriko. I soon found out that Noriko lived in Northern Ireland, and I think that connection, because I'm from Ireland and she's living in Northern Ireland, that connection also made me interested in listening to what she has to say. Maybe if she didn't live in Northern Ireland, I wouldn't have started listening, but I did, and I enjoyed it. And then I moved on, as I said, to Nihongo Konteppe. There are many blogs in Japanese. Sorry, blogs. There are many podcasts in Japanese, but perhaps Nihongo Konteppe is one of the more popular blogs where I said again, popular podcasts where the what do you call it, the speaker, the person making the podcast just talks, basically just talks in Japanese Tepe speaks English and Spanish, so sometimes he uses English and Spanish in the lesson to clarify things, but mostly it's Japanese, and it's quite interesting. He's quite motivational even for Japanese people, especially Japanese people studying languages. I recommend listening to his podcast. Anyway, so I listened to his podcast, and I've started listening to many more. Perhaps I will talk about them on another date. But basically, that is why I became interested in podcasts, and that is part of the reason I wanted to make my own podcast. I wanted my students to have resources like I have, resources that were created by Noriko and Teppei. So I wanted people to hear natural spoken English, non-scripted, like no script, daihon nashi. I learned that from listening to Teppei, daihon nashi. So there's no script. Oh, sorry, that's Japanese if you're not a Japanese person listening to this podcast. I'm mumbling now. I'm not sure what I lost my train of thought. When you forget what you are about to say in English, we often say, I lost my train of thought. I lost my train of thought. So I was talking about why I wanted to make this podcast, and then I forgot what I was going to say, but I remember now, don't worry. So I wanted my students to have such a resource. I want my students to be able to listen to a podcast and learn passively, the same way that I can learn passively. So I searched for some podcasts, and there are some good podcasts out there, and there are some famous podcasts, but I wanted a podcast especially for Japanese people. Because I have been teaching Japanese people English for the last almost 20 years, I am familiar with the mistakes or the misconceptions that Japanese people have about English. So I wanted to help you help you to improve your English and to remove some of these mistakes. I wanted to help you get used to listening to natural spoken English, and hopefully you will become a better speaker too. Of course, I am making this podcast especially for Japanese people, but I think anybody who is learning English, and especially those people interested in Japanese culture, because I will be talking about Japanese culture somewhat, because I live in Japan. I will be talking about my life in Japan and in Okinawa. I lost my train of thought again. Yes, so I wanted to provide a resource for those students in particular, and for Japanese people in general. But again, anybody is welcome to listen if they want to learn English. I hope you can enjoy, and I hope you can learn something from this podcast. Thank you again for listening to the This and That English podcast. This was my second episode. I hope I wasn't speaking too quickly, although I feel maybe it was a little bit fast. If you have any comments, if you have any feedback, if you have any questions or suggestions, please feel free to let me know. You can contact me on my website at thisandthatenglish.com or on Twitter My Twitter handle is this and that ENG. ENG is short for English. This and that ENG, or on my website again at thisandthatenglish.com. No hyphens, no spaces. Thank you very much. See you next time.